the regular visitors to Mickey Z's website have ordained themselves the Expendables. Mickey asked them to write a collective bio for his public talks. Here's the result. Mickey Z's voice is the roundhouse kick of activist literature, profoundly mistrustful of government in all its dreadful guises, while courageously supporting all of us who stand against it. Determined to live the words rather than simply to speak them, Mickey Z doesn't get more readers, he just gets more friends. His blog is like a front stoop, where we all gather to talk over the news, what's happening with each other, and generally enjoy each other's company. The gentle concern for his fellow humans and the behind-the-scenes acts of kindness are surpassed only by the cuteness of his dimples. And now this is his official bio. Born and raised in Astoria, Mickey Z is probably the only person on the planet to have appeared in both a karate flick with Billy Blanks and a political book with Noam Chomsky. Armed with only a high school diploma, Mickey Z has spoken and lectured in venues ranging from Yale University and MIT to ABC No Rio and the Broadway branch of the Queensborough Public Library. He is the author of 5 nonfiction books, and his work has also appeared in more than 10 published anthologies. His novel, CPR for Dummies, was released last month and can be found on the web at mickeyz.net. Newsday calls Mickey Z a professional iconoclast. Time Out New York says he's a political provocateur. To historian Howard Zinn, he's iconoclastic and bold. Sander Hicks asks of him, how can one be so sweet and yet so fierce? Here he is, doing his best to bring sexy back to radical activism, Mickey Z.
Let's hear it again for Val and Rob. Just for the sake of clarification, the book CPR for Dummies is a novel, not a how-to book. Although I have been known to do mouth-to-mouth on occasion. All you got to do is ask. And we have some books and CDs for sale after the event is over, should you be interested. Now, I'm going to preface my presentation tonight with a little story about September 11th. But I'm not talking about September 11, 2001, but rather September 11, 1973. Because on that date, the United States government helped sponsor and fund a military coup in the South American country of Chile, overthrowing the democratically elected President Salvador Allende and killing him. They said he committed suicide with the machine gun. In his place, the U.S. propped up the dictator, General Augusto Pinochet. Not surprisingly, shortly after Pinochet took power, human rights violations in Chile skyrocketed. Surprisingly, one person in the U.S. power structure actually mentioned it. David Popper was the U.S. ambassador to Chile at the time, and he sent a cable to the State Department complaining about the human rights violations. Well, the Secretary of State in the mid-70s was a man named Henry Kissinger. Kissinger's response was short and sweet. He said, tell Popper to cut out the political science lectures. Now, I may not have anything approaching a college degree, but I have taken one political science course in my life, so I get it. And therefore, in a rare example of synchronicity with the Nobel Peace Prize winning Henry Kissinger, I promise there will be no political science lectures here tonight. So first of all, let me say welcome to the People's Republic of Astoria. Yeah. Here in New York City, in New York State, in the white supremacist, capitalist, homophobic patriarchy we call America. Or as it's known to the indigenous crowd, the occupied territories. Now, speaking of occupied territories, while I'm up here tonight blowing out hot air, I want you guys to keep a couple of things in mind. First of all, we're all at this moment standing or sitting on stolen land. Secondly, each minute that passes as I'm talking the US government spends 1 million of your tax dollars on war. And thirdly, on this planet of abundant resources, every 2 seconds, a human being starves to death. Now that typically quiets the crowd and gives me a chance to let you know that I am available for children's parties. Now, speaking of millions spent on war and far too many people dying, yesterday was an interesting but forgotten anniversary. You see, for most people, the beginning of the Iraq War occurred on March 19, 2003. Now, I say that if you agree that that's the starting date of the war, I lost her already. That was bad. If you agree that March 19th is the starting date of the war, you are putting a little bit too much emphasis on one party in particular and one president in particular. A far more accurate starting date was 18 years ago yesterday, on August 6, 1990. Because on August 2nd, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait with US permission. 4 days later, at the behest of the United States, the United Nations Security Council imposed murderous sanctions upon the people of Iraq, and the war began that day. Those sanctions are universally agreed to have cost roughly 500,000 deaths of Iraqi children under the age of 5. US Secretary of State in the mid-90s, Madeleine Albright, was famously asked on 60 Minutes if she thought 500,000 dead Iraqi babies was a price worth paying to pursue US foreign policy, and she famously said, "We think it's worth it." Shortly after that, she was named Secretary of State by the noted liberal Democrat hero, Bill Clinton. Now, I highlight Bill Clinton's Democratic status because I'm not here necessarily to preach to the converted. I don't know too many of you, but I'm going to assume that you don't really need me to highlight too much of what's wrong with the Bush administration. And I don't get many opportunities to do this. So I'm not going to focus solely on the figurehead of empire, but rather I'd rather dig a little bit deeper, directly down to the heart of our culture. A culture riddled with hypocrisy and violence. And speaking of riddles, I have one for you. Who gave up a life of luxury, turned his back on millions, to fight for what he believed in the mountains and caves of Afghanistan, and as a result is revered by many as a hero? Anybody? Well, any of you know this already. Osama. Now there's an equally accurate answer to that question. Pat Tillman. So Pat Tillman, Osama bin Laden. Two equally accurate answers to the same question, thus proving once again that perception is reality. Now whether or not you believe Tillman or Osama is a hero depends largely on which propaganda is reaching your ears. Now I know propaganda is not a term commonly used in polite discourse in this country. We prefer euphemisms like public relations, spin, hype, etc. But don't kid yourself. We live in a corporate propaganda state. And perhaps my favorite example of life in a corporate propaganda state is the daily New York Times corrections box. Every day the newspaper of record comes clean about what it got wrong the day before. For example, earlier this year they ran a cutting-edge article on the topic of tattoos. Well, the next day in the corrections box, they clarified that in that article they misidentified the status of Gwen Stefani's tattoos. And they pointed out that Gwen Stefani has no permanent tattoos. So our long national nightmare is over. We could all sleep better tonight. We know that Gwen Stefani has no permanent tattoos. Now the tacit, unspoken message of that daily New York Times corrections box is that besides a few minor typographical errors, everything else that appeared in yesterday's New York Times was correct, or accurate, or to use their language, was fit to print, and is now passed on to become part of our official history. This is a fine example of life in a society dominated by a corporate-owned media. Now, whether you choose to label them liberal or conservative, most major media outlets are large corporations owned by or aligned with even larger corporations, and they share one common goal, that is to make a profit by selling a product, an affluent audience, to a given market, advertisers. Therefore, we shouldn't find it too shocking that the image of the world being presented by a corporate-owned press very much reflects the biased interests of the elite players in this sordid little love triangle. That's why just about every major newspaper on a daily basis has a business section, but none of them have a labor section. That's why at least once a week there's an automobile section, but none of them have a bicycle section. And that's why when the Dow Jones Industrial Average